So I wanted to talk a little bit about if you have a partner that you suspect may have either a substance abuse problem or alcohol abuse. Alcohol is probably one of the most prevalent because it's the easiest to get access to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different changes in personality or kind of types of personalities that you'll see with someone who's suffering from substance or alcohol abuse. I'm going to talk about how, as their partner, how you may feel or how you're made to feel, and generally talk a little bit about what you can do if that's the case. So one of the first things you might notice about your partner, the way that they might change, is there might be some secrecy all of a sudden or deception. All of a sudden they may be leaving out details about where they're going to go that night after work. And if you do catch them in a lie, or if you ask pretty standard questions, who's going to be there and what time do you think you'll be home, the person may be very defensive. They may accuse you of being controlling, and especially if the topic of addiction comes up when you're having this interaction. And this does also lead to kind of mood swings. I've had a lot of clients tell me it's like they're with Jekyll and Hyde, and they know the person they love is there, but they're getting kind of farther and farther from the surface. Their partners are getting set off by these littlest things, whether it's questions you're asking about them, or if you don't give them what they want. Someone who's suffering, especially from substance abuse, can be really manipulative about wanting money, and if you say no, they can get extremely angry. And what happens is, if you are susceptible to someone who's angry and you end up being the kind of person who this is really uncomfortable, and you end up being more likely to enable your partner. You don't want them to get angry with you. They yell, they have a hissy fit, and so you may end up buying the alcohol, supplying the money for the drugs they're going to buy, which really is a disservice to them.
Yeah, and to yourself. I mean, this kind of goes back to a little bit what we were talking about in the previous week, where you start just doing everything in the relationship for the other person and really forgetting about yourself, and you're really just managing the other person. That's not a relationship, that's a management.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think this issue of these people who are suffering from substance abuse, they often say, well, you're trying to control me, but I think you're right. It does become a feeling of you want to manage the relationship. And so, yes, there might be an inclination where you do feel like you want to control because this person is so out of control. For instance, you might feel really anxious about bringing your partner to a social gathering, work gathering, family event, because you're afraid of how they're going to act or how much they're going to drink. You may end up avoiding these altogether, which isolates you, but this only serves to protect your partner's alcoholism or substance abuse problem. So if you find yourself making excuses as to why you're not going to go to something based on the fear of how your partner may act, that's probably a good indicator that there's a problem here, or at least it should be. You should start thinking about what's going on as far as how your partner is drinking and if it's over the top or becomes excess.
Yeah, and this is a really hard position to be in because you feel like if you don't protect them and you don't stay with them for parties or you don't buy them the alcohol or drugs, that's like saying that you don't love them and you don't care for them. Mm-hmm. But also if you buy them the alcohol or drugs, you're hurting them. So it feels like a lose-lose. Feels mm-hmm. totally hopeless.
Right. When you do that, when you're supplying that money or alcohol or the drugs to your partner, you're not loving your partner, you're loving their disease. That's who you're communicating with. And what I think is important to remember is that somebody in the clutches of an addiction is not the person you know. So who you're talking to is the person who's going to do whatever it takes to get that next fix. And at the same time, you're involved in what I would call a parallel process because you become addicted to the hope of having that loving partner you used to have. And so in a sense, you're addicted to your partner. There's an addiction of hoping that you're going to get that almost high again when they treat you right and loving the way they used to. But again, that person is so far below the addiction, you're really chasing what they would call the white dragon. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I mean, what are you supposed to do when you're in that hopeless situation? How do you stop giving them the drugs or buy them the drugs or stop enabling them in whichever way you are and do what you think is right or you're supposed to be doing?
Right. Well, I think with the enabling, you have to be okay with them getting angry with you. They will get angry with you, but at some point, if they do reach sobriety, they will thank you for saving their life. But that anger is going to come first because you're getting in the way of their next high or their next fix. They can't see far past the next hit or the next drink.
Yeah, and it's hard for them to be angry at you, right? Because it goes back again it attacks you, and then you're like, oh, I'm not doing anything for them, and you'll believe them because they'll say, oh, you're taking this away from me, you don't love me, you don't care for me anymore, or they'll start threatening you like, oh, I'm just going to the streets to get the drugs, I'm gonna do any destructive activity to get what they want. So it puts you in a really bad situation all the time.
Right, and that's part of the manipulation that comes with the addiction. I mean, the addiction can make people so desperate that they'll do whatever it takes or say whatever needs to be said to get what they're wanting in that moment. But you have to kind of remind yourself, well, you're getting put into a hostage situation in a sense, because now if you don't buy these things, you're being threatened that this person will leave you, or you're being accused of not being loving. You have to really be okay with them being angry, because that's what happens when you set boundaries and when you start saying no.
Yeah, so what are some good things for the person in the relationship with the addict to do to help them get ready, just to have all the feelings and all the threats coming at them?
Well, I usually recommend having some sense of community. I think Al-Anon is a really good tool. And Al-Anon, for people who don't know, is an anonymous group that you can go to that is specifically for families or children, parents, people suffering who have a loved one who is suffering from an addiction. And you get the support that you need there. You feel more understood. There is kind of this stigma that it is really religious, but it's spiritual. You can take what you want away from it, but because substance abuse and alcohol abuse is a family disease and affects everyone involved, it's really good to have a community that you can go to help you feel supported during this time. And I also recommend one-on-one, individual therapy, just because you're going to have a lot of emotions as far as if you do have to separate from this person. You may have to practice radical acceptance of they might not want to get better at this time, and you would have to make the choice. Do you want to stay in this destructive relationship, or is it time to get out? And if it's time to get out, I think you need a lot of support with that. It's hard.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to leave a relationship because then you could feel like you're abandoning them. They'll just tell you you're abandoning them. So you get all these feelings laid on you that will just be overwhelming. And the easiest thing to do is to just stay in the situation, stay in the pattern.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, people can threaten suicide, or people can threaten that, well, I'm just going to drink myself to death. But, I encourage you not to take on that responsibility. If they're choosing to behave badly out of revenge, that's not your responsibility. You have to make sure that you do take care of yourself. And sometimes people need to have people leave them in order to recognize and realize, wow, this addiction is destroying my life. I am out of control. Because when someone is an addict, it's not in their control anymore. You can't pray this away. There are physiological steps you have to take to gain sobriety. And even after those first 30 days of being sober, that's when people usually describe coming out of the fog. So 30 days, 90 days, around there, people start coming out of this fog and are starting to kind of separate from the addiction. But there's a lot of work after that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work on the addict's part. But you also had to remember, as the person who's with the addict, that you're supposed to be their lover, not their savior. Mm-hmm. And those are two very different things, and we can get really confused. We can confuse the two, think that if I love them, I will always save them. And that's not how that works.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think you also bring up a good point that sometimes we confuse loyalty with love. But if you're loyal to someone who really is making the substance of choice a priority and not you, that's not really a fair relationship to be in. And by staying with that person with that behavior, if they're not trying to get help, it's kind of almost saying to them in a nonverbal way, well, this behavior is acceptable, and this, I'm willing to put up with this, but, that's not a message you want to send to someone who's suffering from this disease. You want to show them that, you want a healthier relationship, and if you're not going to be the priority, that you are going to leave. They will lose people when, they're in the throes of the addiction if they're not trying to get some help.
Yeah, and that forces them to really start to think about the consequences of their addiction and choosing, like, am I going to lose this person or am I going to lose the addiction? And then you can be there as a support on either way to decide. If they're choosing the addiction, you can support that by going and taking care of yourself. If they choose you, you can bring them to a clinic, or there's lots of different ways to help people get help for addiction while still helping yourself at the same time.
Right, and I mean, if you're not sure what to do if you want to stay together or break up, you can have a trial separation. You could be separate and support them while they're getting clean, and you can say to them, I'm not going to be with you until you're clean, but I'm going to support you along the way if you're trying to get help. So you can have a little bit of a distance from them to kind of regain your balance emotionally while still being supportive of them in their treatment.
Yeah, and the separation is also good for you, because we start getting really tied up in does my lover need, the addict. You always focus on what do they need, and we forget about ourselves completely. We don't even think about ourselves. So sometimes that separation is there to help us also get out of that fog, in a sense, the fog of the pattern in the environment. So you can get a handle on yourself, because you also start to lose control of your own emotions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And usually when there's an addict in any family, it's because there are other things that are going on that may not be talked about. I mean, that's why the Betty Ford Clinic is up and available, because this is just such a family disease. And so you do get really pulled into the addiction with the person. And so you do kind of have to separate, in a sense, to come back to yourself, what you want, what you need, what you're willing to compromise on, and what you're not willing to compromise on.
Yeah. So if you had one suggestion to someone who has an addict as a lover, what would you tell them to do?
Get into therapy and have an individual therapist. I think it was probably the most important thing, because it's really helpful to have something structured. Usually people meet every week, something structured. When you have such a chaotic lifestyle, when you are living or in a relationship with an addict. So even that 1 hour a week, that same day, that same time, is going to start to bring structure to your life, and you can grow that, and your therapist will help you grow that and help you really to figure out what choice is going to be the best for you when it comes to your partner.
Yeah, because if you want to help and support someone else, you have to be taking care of yourself first. Because if you're not taking care of yourself, what use can you be to anyone else?
Absolutely.